A typical Monday morning at Southridge International Airport was about to become anything but ordinary. The bustling terminal was filled with the usual mix of travelers: business people clutching their briefcases, families heading for vacations, and solo adventurers with their backpacks. Among them was James Thompson, a 42-year-old African-American executive who had made this journey countless times before. James stood out in the crowd, not just because of his impressive 6'2" frame, but because of his impeccable appearance. Dressed in a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, crisp white shirt, and polished black Oxford shoes, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had earned his success through years of hard work. As the regional director of sales for Tech Solutions International, traveling was second nature to him. That morning, James had arrived at the airport 2 hours early for his flight to Chicago, where he was scheduled to present at a major technology conference. His presentation materials were carefully organized in his leather briefcase, and his carry-on suitcase contained 3 days' worth of business attire. Everything was planned down to the smallest detail, just as he liked it. The security checkpoint area was moderately busy, with 3 lanes open and lines moving at a steady pace. James joined the queue in lane 2, where a security guard named Sarah Miller was checking IDs and boarding passes. Sarah, a woman in her mid-30s with blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun, had been working at the airport for the past 5 years. As James moved forward in line, he couldn't help but notice how Sarah's demeanor changed with different passengers. She smiled warmly at some, barely glanced at others. But when her eyes fell on James, something shifted in her expression. Her face hardened, and her lips pressed into a thin line. When it was finally James's turn, he stepped forward with his ID and boarding pass ready, offering a professional smile. "Good morning," he said, handing over his documents. Sarah took them without responding to his greeting, her movements sharp and abrupt. The atmosphere grew tense as Sarah began examining James's ID with unusual scrutiny. She turned it over multiple times, held it up to the light, and squinted at it as if searching for flaws. Other passengers in line started to notice the unusual attention being paid to James's documents. "Is there a problem?" James asked calmly, maintaining his composure despite the growing discomfort of the situation. He had faced similar treatment before and had learned that staying professional was the best approach. Sarah's response was cold and clipped. "These documents need additional verification," she announced loudly, drawing even more attention to the situation. "Step aside, please." James noticed that the elderly white couple who had been in front of him had barely received a glance at their documents before being waved through. The young Asian family behind him was also processed quickly while he waited. Minutes ticked by as Sarah made a show of examining his perfectly valid identification and boarding pass. Other travelers began to exchange concerned glances. A young woman a few spots back in line discreetly took out her phone and started recording. 2 business travelers who had already passed through security stopped to watch the scene unfold, their expressions showing growing concern. James remained standing to the side, his heart racing despite his calm exterior. He had worked too hard and come too far to let this incident derail his important presentation. He checked his watch. He still had plenty of time before his flight, but this unnecessary delay was becoming increasingly frustrating. "My ID is valid, and my boarding pass was issued by the airline just this morning," James stated firmly but politely. "I've been flying through this airport twice a month for the past 3 years without any issues." Sarah's response was to pick up her phone and call for a supervisor, all while avoiding direct eye contact with James. "I need additional verification on a passenger's documentation," she spoke into the phone, her voice carrying an edge that made several nearby passengers shift uncomfortably. The tension in the security area was palpable. Other security personnel at adjacent lanes cast uncertain glances toward the situation but continued processing their own lines of passengers. The morning light streaming through the terminal's huge windows seemed to highlight the scene like a spotlight, drawing even more attention to the unfolding drama. Little did anyone know that this was just the beginning of an incident that would soon explode into something much bigger, involving not just James and Sarah, but also someone whose arrival would change everything. The situation at the security checkpoint continued to escalate as more passengers gathered to witness the unfolding scene. Sarah Miller's behavior became increasingly aggressive as she waited for her supervisor to arrive. She began asking James questions that seemed completely unrelated to: "How did you get this ID? Where exactly do you work? Why are you traveling to Chicago? Sarah fired these questions at James in rapid succession, her voice getting louder with each question. The discriminatory nature of her interrogation was becoming more obvious to everyone watching. James maintained his professional demeanor, though his patience was being severely tested. As I mentioned, I'm the regional director at Tech Solutions International. I have all my business cards and company identification with me as well, he replied, reaching into his briefcase to provide additional documentation. Don't move, Sarah suddenly shouted, causing several nearby passengers to jump. Keep your hands where I can see them. Her reaction to James's simple movement was so extreme that even her fellow security officers looked uncomfortable. By now, at least 5 people had their phones out, recording the incident. A middle-aged woman in a business suit stepped forward from the line. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she declared loudly. "I've been watching this whole thing, and you haven't treated anyone else this way. This is clearly racial profiling." Other voices joined in, supporting James. A college student spoke up. "I'm going to post this online right now. This is not okay." An elderly gentleman who had passed through security earlier came back and started taking notes, identifying himself as a retired civil rights attorney. The mounting pressure seemed to make Sarah even more determined to assert her authority. She began claiming there were irregularities with James's documentation, though she couldn't specify what these supposed irregularities were. Her hands were shaking slightly as she held his ID, and her face had turned red. "I'm not letting you through," Sarah announced firmly. "These documents need to be thoroughly investigated. You'll have to reschedule your flight." Her statement caused an audible gasp from the growing crowd of onlookers. James took a deep breath before responding. "Ma'am, I understand you're doing your job, but this is discrimination. I'd like to speak to your supervisor immediately." His voice remained steady, but there was an edge of steel in it now. Just then, rapid footsteps approached from the direction of the security office. The crowd parted to reveal a tall man in a senior security uniform walking briskly toward them. His name tag identified him as Michael Miller, head of airport security. As he got closer, several observers noticed something that added another layer of complexity to the situation. He was wearing a wedding ring that matched Sarah's. Michael took in the scene quickly, the crowd of onlookers with their phones raised, his wife's hostile stance, and James's dignified but clearly frustrated expression. His face darkened as he overheard Sarah's latest comment about suspicious documentation. "What's going on here?" Michael asked, his voice carrying the weight of authority. Before Sarah could respond, several passengers began speaking at once, describing what they had witnessed. Sarah's face went pale as she realized her husband was now involved. "Michael, I was just following procedures," she began, but her voice trailed off as he held up his hand to stop her. Michael turned to James first. "Sir, may I see your documentation?" he asked professionally. James handed over his ID and boarding pass, which Michael examined quickly and efficiently. "Everything is in perfect order," Michael announced after a brief review. He turned to face his wife, his expression a mixture of disappointment and anger. "Sarah, step away from the checkpoint immediately." The crowd watched in stunned silence as Michael pulled out his radio. "This is Miller. I need a replacement officer at Checkpoint 2 immediately, and send HR to my office." His voice was firm and professional, but there was no mistaking the tension underneath. Sarah stood frozen, her face a mask of shock as she realized the gravity of the situation. Her hands trembled as she unpinned her badge, the reality of what she had done finally seeming to sink in. The replacement officer arrived quickly, and Michael turned back to James. "Mr. Thompson, please allow me to personally escort you through security. We need to make sure you make your flight, and then you and I need to have a conversation about what happened here today." As they walked away from the checkpoint, the crowd began to disperse, but not before several people approached James to offer their contact information as witnesses. The incident was far from over, and its repercussions were about to spread far beyond the walls of Southridge International Airport. In Michael Miller's office, the atmosphere was tense. The spacious room on the second floor of the airport terminal offered a clear view of the runways, but nobody was paying attention to the planes taking off and landing. James sat in a comfortable leather chair across from Michael's desk, while 2 representatives from the airport's Human Resources Department occupied seats along the wall. "Mr. Thompson, first and foremost, I want to extend my deepest personal apologies for what happened down there, Michael began, his face showing genuine remorse. What you experienced was completely unacceptable and goes against everything this airport stands for. James nodded, maintaining his composure. I appreciate your quick response to the situation, Mr. Miller. But I have to ask, how long has this been going on? How many other travelers might have faced similar treatment? The question hung heavy in the air. Michael exchanged glances with the HR representatives before responding. We're going to conduct a full investigation into all past incidents, he assured James. We'll be reviewing security footage and incident reports from Sarah's entire employment history. As they spoke, Michael's computer chimed with incoming emails. The videos of the incident had already started circulating on social media. One clip had gained over 50,000 views in just the past hour, and news outlets were beginning to reach out for comments. Sir, your phone is ringing, one of the HR representatives pointed out to James. He checked the display. It was his company's CEO calling. The incident was clearly escalating beyond the airport's walls. James answered the call, putting it on speaker as a professional courtesy. James, I just saw the video. His CEO's voice filled the room. Are you all right? Do you need our legal team to get involved? I'm currently in a meeting with the head of airport security, who is handling the situation, James replied calmly. And yes, I think having our legal team review this would be appropriate. The HR representatives were furiously taking notes as the conversation continued. Outside the office, they could hear increased activity in the hallway as more airport officials gathered to deal with the growing situation. Michael picked up his desk phone. Send Sarah in, he instructed someone. A few moments later, Sarah entered the office, her face pale and her hands clasped tightly together. She had changed out of her security uniform and was wearing civilian clothes. Sit down, Sarah, Michael directed, his voice professional but cold. She took a seat, carefully avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. Would you like to explain your actions at the security checkpoint? Michael asked her. The question seemed to echo in the silent office. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her chair. I was just trying to be thorough, she mumbled, but her weak excuse fell flat in the face of the video evidence and multiple witness statements. Thorough? James spoke up, his voice controlled but firm. I've been through that checkpoint dozens of times. Never once was I treated with such obvious discrimination until today. The elderly white couple before me barely got a glance. The Asian family behind me went through without issue. But I was singled out, questioned, and treated like a criminal. Sarah's face flushed red, but she remained silent. The HR representatives exchanged glances and continued their note-taking. Sarah, Michael said, his voice heavy with authority, your actions today were not just unprofessional. They were discriminatory and potentially illegal. You've put this airport at risk of a major lawsuit, damaged our reputation, and most importantly, you violated our core principles of treating every passenger with respect and dignity. He pulled out a document from his desk drawer. This is your immediate termination notice. HR will escort you to collect your belongings. Your airport security credentials have already been deactivated. Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. But Michael, we're married. You can't just. That's precisely why I must. Michael cut her off. My personal relationship with you cannot and will not affect my professional duties. What you did today was wrong, and as head of security, I have to take immediate action. The HR representative stood up, indicating it was time for Sarah to leave. As she was led out of the office, tears streaming down her face, the reality of her actions and their consequences seemed to finally hit her. James watched the scene unfold with a mixture of emotions. While he hadn't come to the airport expecting to be part of such an incident, he realized that his experience might help prevent similar situations in the future. The story was far from over, but at least justice was being served. The news of the incident spread like wildfire through social media and news outlets. By late afternoon, the airport's press room was packed with reporters from local and national media. Camera crews set up their equipment while journalists checked their phones for updates on the viral videos, which had now reached millions of views. In a conference room away from the media frenzy, James sat with his company's legal team, who had flown in immediately after seeing the videos. The airport's lawyers were also present, along with Michael and senior airport management. The tension in the room was palpable as they discussed the next steps. Mr. Thompson, the airport's chief lawyer began, we want to handle this situation properly. The airport is prepared to take full responsibility for this incident and implement immediate changes to prevent anything like this from happening again. James leaned forward in his chair. I appreciate that, but this isn't just about me. What happened today highlights a bigger problem that needs addressing. How many other travelers have faced similar discrimination but didn't have witnesses or viral videos to support them? Michael nodded in agreement. We've already begun reviewing our security footage from the past 6 months. Our preliminary findings are concerning. He pushed a folder across the table. We've identified at least 12 similar incidents involving Sarah, though none as blatant as today's. The legal teams exchanged glances. James's corporate lawyer spoke up. This could be grounds for a class action lawsuit. However, Mr. Thompson has expressed interest in working towards a more constructive solution. Indeed, James had been thinking beyond just legal action. During his years in corporate leadership, he had learned that real change often required more than just punitive measures. He pulled out his tablet and opened a document he'd been working on. I have a proposal, he announced. Instead of focusing solely on legal action, I suggest we use this incident as a catalyst for change. I want to help develop a comprehensive anti-bias training program for all airport security personnel. The room fell silent as James continued. My company specializes in technology solutions. We can help create virtual reality training scenarios that put security officers in the shoes of travelers who face discrimination. Additionally, I'm willing to serve on an advisory board to oversee the implementation of new security protocols. Michael's face lit up with interest. That's actually brilliant, he said. Combining technology with real-world experience could make the training much more effective than traditional methods. As they discussed the details, a knock on the door interrupted them. An airport PR representative entered with urgent news. The media is requesting statements from both Mr. Thompson and Mr. Miller. The story has gone national, and several civil rights organizations have already issued statements. James and Michael exchanged looks. They both knew that how they handled the media would be crucial in transforming this incident from a scandal into an opportunity for positive change. Before we face the media, James said, I want to make something clear. This isn't about destroying careers or generating negative publicity. It's about addressing systemic issues and creating real solutions. Michael stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the busy airport below. I agree, and I want to be completely transparent about something. He turned back to face the room. Sarah's actions today forced me to fire my wife, but they also opened my eyes to problems I should have seen sooner. As head of security, that failure falls on me too. The legal teams began drafting statements while James and Michael prepared for their press conference. They decided to present a united front, showing how collaboration between those affected by discrimination and those in positions of power could lead to meaningful change. As they waited to face the media, James received another call from his CEO. James, I just wanted you to know that the board has approved your proposal. Whatever resources you need for this training program, they're yours. The support from his company reinforced James's belief that this incident, as unfortunate as it was, could lead to positive changes in airport security practices nationwide. As he straightened his tie and prepared to face the cameras, he felt a sense of purpose. This wasn't just about one discriminatory security guard anymore. It was about creating lasting change in a system that needed it. Michael put a hand on James's shoulder. Ready? He asked. James nodded. Ready. Let's show them how we're going to turn this situation into something positive. Together, they walked toward the press room, prepared to transform a story of discrimination into one of progress and change. The press conference room buzzed with energy as cameras flashed and reporters readied their microphones. James and Michael stood side by side at the podium, their presence commanding attention. The airport's PR director had arranged the room carefully, with the airport's logo prominently displayed behind them. Good evening, Michael began, his voice steady despite the pressure. Today, an unacceptable incident of racial. As head of airport security, I want to be clear. Such behavior has no place in our airport or anywhere else. James stepped forward next, his calm demeanor impressing everyone present. What happened today was unfortunately not an isolated incident. However, the response to it gives me hope. When people saw injustice, They didn't stay silent. They recorded it, spoke up, and demanded action. A reporter raised her hand. Mr. Thompson, we've learned that Mrs. Miller has released a statement on social media claiming she was just following security protocols. How do you respond to that? Before James could answer, Michael intervened. I'll address that directly. I've reviewed all security protocols personally. There is nothing in our procedures that justifies targeting passengers based on race. My wife's actions were her own and reflected personal bias, not airport policy. The boldness of Michael's statement caused a stir among the reporters. Another journalist stood up. Mr. Miller, how difficult was it to fire your own wife? This isn't about personal relationships, Michael replied firmly. This is about doing what's right. When we see discrimination, we must act, regardless of our personal connections to those involved. James then revealed their plans for change. Today, we're announcing a new initiative. Working with my company, Tech Solutions International, will be developing a state-of-the-art training program using virtual reality technology to combat bias in airport security. The announcement generated excited murmurs throughout the room. A technology reporter asked for details, and James explained how the program would work. Security officers will experience scenarios from multiple perspectives, he explained. They'll feel what it's like to be unfairly profiled, to be treated with suspicion for no valid reason. We believe this immersive experience will create lasting change in attitudes and behavior. As the press conference continued, Sarah Miller was sitting in her living room, watching it all unfold on television. Her social media statement had backfired badly, with thousands of negative comments and shares. Her phone kept buzzing with messages from friends and family, some supportive, others expressing disappointment in her actions. Back at the press conference, a civil rights attorney who had been invited to attend stood up to speak. We're pleased to announce that our organization will be partnering with the airport to monitor the implementation of these new training programs and ensure their effectiveness. The positive tone of the press conference was shifting the narrative. What had started as a scandal was transforming into a story of progressive change and accountability. Reporters who had come expecting to cover a controversial incident were now writing about innovative solutions to systemic problems. After the formal statements, James and Michael took a few more questions. One reporter asked about Sarah's future in airport security. While I can't discuss specific personnel matters, Michael responded, I can say that anyone terminated for discriminatory behavior will not be eligible for rehiring at this or any partner airport. We'd have to send a clear message that bias has consequences. As the press conference wound down, James received a text message from his daughter, a college student studying social justice. Dad, I'm so proud of you. You're turning this terrible experience into something positive. The message reminded him why this mattered so much. It wasn't just about one incident or one person. It was about creating a better future for everyone. After the reporters left, James and Michael sat down for a moment in the empty press room. Both men were exhausted but satisfied with how things had gone. Thank you, Michael said quietly. You could have just filed a lawsuit and walked away. Instead, you're helping us become better. James nodded. Sometimes the hardest experiences create the best opportunities for change. But our work is just beginning. They both knew he was right. The press conference had been successful, but implementing real change would take time, effort, and dedication. As they gathered their things to leave, they could hear airport announcements echoing through the building, reminding them that thousands of travelers were counting on them to make air travel safer and fairer for everyone. The day was ending, but the journey toward meaningful change was just beginning. The real work would start tomorrow. 2 weeks after the incident, the changes at Southridge International Airport were already visible. New signs in multiple languages welcomed travelers, emphasizing the airport's commitment to fair and respectful treatment of all passengers. Security officers wore newly designed badges that included not just their names, but also their training certification in anti-bias procedures. In a large training room converted into a temporary tech center, James was overseeing the installation of the first virtual reality training stations. Engineers from his company worked alongside airport staff, setting up equipment and fine-tuning the software. Can you believe we developed this in just 2 weeks? One of the engineers asked James, adjusting a VR headset. The program had been fast-tracked with unprecedented speed. thanks to the combined efforts of Tech Solutions International and the airport administration. James gestured to the 5 VR stations set up around the room. We're ready. This first module puts officers in situations where they'll experience discrimination firsthand. It's powerful stuff. The training program had generated significant interest from other airports nationwide. 3 major airports had already reached out, requesting information about implementing similar systems. The incident that had started with one security guard's bias was sparking a national conversation about airport security practices. Meanwhile, Sarah Miller's story had taken an unexpected turn. After her termination, she had gone through a period of deep reflection. Instead of becoming bitter, she had reached out to civil rights organizations, offering to share her story as an example of how unconscious bias can affect judgment and decision-making. Back in the training room, the first group of security officers arrived. They looked nervous but interested as James and Michael explained the program. One by one, they put on the VR headsets and began experiencing scenarios from different perspectives. "Oh my God," whispered one officer, clearly moved by what she was experiencing. In the simulation, she was experiencing what it felt like to be unfairly profiled and detained. "I had no idea it felt like this." As the training session progressed, journalists from a national news network filmed quietly from the corner. The story of how an airport had transformed a crisis into an opportunity for positive change had captured public interest. During a break, Michael received a call from the airport's board of directors. After a brief conversation, he turned to James with a smile. They'd approved the expansion of the program. "We're getting 5 more VR stations and doubling the training staff." The news energized everyone in the room. What had started as a response to a crisis was becoming a model for airports across the country. James's phone buzzed with a message from his CEO. "Just got calls from 2 more airports. They want the same program. This is bigger than we imagined." As the afternoon continued, more security officers went through the training. Each one emerged with a new perspective, many of them sharing personal reflections about times they might have acted on unconscious bias without realizing it. One veteran officer approached James after completing the program. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I've been doing this job for 15 years. I always thought I treated everyone the same, but this experience, it makes you think differently." Michael gathered everyone for a debrief session at the end of the day. The room was filled with security officers, trainers, and tech staff, all sharing their experiences and insights. "What happened 2 weeks ago was a wake-up call," Michael addressed the group. "But look at what we've created from that moment. We're not just changing our airport, we're starting a movement." James stood next to him, adding, "The technology is just a tool. The real change happens in here." He pointed to his heart, and in here, he touched his head. It's about understanding and empathy. As the day went down and people began leaving, James received one more significant message. A major civil rights organization wanted to present him and the airport with an award for innovative approaches to combating discrimination. Michael read the message over James's shoulder and smiled. "From crisis to award-winning program in 2 weeks. Not bad." "It's just the beginning," James replied, watching as the last of the training participants left the room. "Real change takes time, but we started something important here." They looked around the room, at the VR stations that represented not just technology, but a new way of thinking about training and awareness. The incident that had brought them together had evolved into something neither of them could have predicted. A catalyst for change that would impact airports and travelers across the country. 6 months after the incident, Southridge International Airport had become a model for diversity and inclusion in airport security. On a bright morning, James stood before a large audience in the airport's main conference center, preparing to deliver the keynote speech at the first National Airport Security Bias Prevention Summit. Representatives from over 50 airports across the country filled the room. The virtual reality training program, now known as Project Perspective, had been implemented at 12 major airports, with more joining every month. The results have been remarkable. Reported incidents of bias had decreased by 78% at participating airports. When I walked through security that day 6 months ago, James began his speech. "I never imagined it would lead to this." Sometimes, the worst moments in our lives become catalysts for the most important changes. In the front row, Michael sat next to his new wife, Karen, an African-American civil rights attorney who had helped develop the legal framework for the training program. Their relationship had blossomed during the months of working together on the project, proving that positive changes could happen on both professional and personal levels. As James continued his presentation, he shared statistics and success stories from various airports. The most powerful moment came when he played video testimonials from security officers whose perspectives had been transformed by the training. During the lunch break, James received surprising news. Sarah Miller, his former antagonist, had been touring smaller airports in the Midwest, sharing her story and speaking about the dangers of unchecked bias. Her journey from perpetrator to advocate had become another powerful component of the program. The summit also featured a technology showcase where Tech Solutions International demonstrated the latest updates to the VR training system. The new version included scenarios based on real incidents reported at airports worldwide, making the training even more relevant and impactful. We've added modules dealing with religious discrimination, disability awareness, and gender bias, James explained to a group of interested airport directors. The program now covers the full spectrum of potential discrimination scenarios. Michael joined him at the demonstration booth, adding, "The most impressive part is how the system adapts to each trainee's responses, identifying areas where they need more focus and guidance." During the afternoon sessions, airport security chiefs shared their experiences implementing the program. Many reported not just decreased incidents of bias, but improved overall security effectiveness. When officers focused on actual security concerns rather than personal bias, they caught more genuine threats. "Our security staff is more efficient now," one chief reported. "They're spending time on real security issues instead of getting distracted by prejudices they didn't even know they had." The summit also addressed the human side of the story. A panel of travelers shared their experiences of discrimination at airports, helping security personnel understand the lasting impact of their actions. The room fell silent as they spoke, their stories touching hearts and changing minds. Toward the end of the day, James received news that made the summit even more meaningful. Congress had just passed legislation requiring all major airports to implement comprehensive anti-bias training programs. The bill, inspired by the success at Southridge, would ensure that the changes they pioneered would become standard practice nationwide. As the summit drew to a close, James and Michael stood together at the podium for final remarks. "What we've accomplished here goes beyond just airport security," Michael said. "We've shown that when we confront bias honestly and directly, real change is possible." James added, "This program works because it doesn't just tell people they're wrong, it helps them understand why and shows them a better way forward." The audience rose in a standing ovation, not just for the speakers but for the transformation they represented. What had started as a discriminatory incident had evolved into a movement that was changing airport security across the nation. After the summit, James walked through the same security checkpoint where everything had started 6 months ago. The difference was striking. Security officers greeted everyone with professional courtesy, and the process moved smoothly and respectfully for all passengers. As he headed toward his gate, James smiled, knowing that his difficult experience had led to positive change for countless travelers. The story that began with discrimination had transformed into one of hope, progress, and the power of turning negative experiences into opportunities for growth. 1 year after the incident, Southridge International Airport hosted a special ceremony to mark the anniversary of Project Perspective and celebrate its remarkable impact. The terminal's main atrium was transformed into an elegant venue, filled with airport officials, security personnel, civil rights leaders, and media representatives from around the world. James Thompson stood at the entrance, greeting guests alongside Michael Miller. Both men had been named in Time magazine's list of 100 most influential people for their work in transforming airport security practices. The article had praised their ability to turn a moment of discrimination into a nationwide movement for change. "Can you believe how far we've come?" Michael asked, straightening his tie. His recent promotion to National Director of Airport Security Training reflected the success of their program. The position had been created specifically to oversee the implementation of bias prevention training across all U.S. airports. The ceremony began with a surprising guest speaker, Sarah Miller. Her journey had become an integral part of the program's success story. After months of self-reflection and personal growth, she had become one of the most effective advocates for change. A year ago, I was the problem. Sarah began her speech, her voice steady but humble. Today, I travel to airports across the country, sharing my story as a warning and a lesson. Change is possible, but first, we must recognize our own biases. The audience listened intently as she described her transformation. After her termination, she had undergone extensive counseling and education in cultural sensitivity. Her willingness to acknowledge her mistakes and work toward redemption had added a powerful dimension to the training program. James took the podium next, sharing the latest statistics. Peace security effectiveness had improved, with officers better able to focus on. But numbers don't tell the whole story, James said. The real success is in the thousands of travelers who now move through security without fear of discrimination, and the security officers who serve with true professional integrity. The ceremony included the unveiling of a new installation in the airport terminal, a wall-sized interactive display showing real-time data from Project Perspective implementations worldwide. Visitors could use touch screens to learn about the program's impact and even experience mini versions of the VR training scenarios. Michael announced the next phase of the project, an international partnership with airports in Europe, Asia, and Africa. Bias knows no borders, he explained, neither should our solution. The most moving moment came when a group of security officers who had completed the first training session shared their experiences. They spoke about how the program had changed not just their professional approach but their personal lives as well. I went home and talked to my children about bias, one officer shared. The training made me realize I needed to break the cycle of prejudice in my own family. As the ceremony continued, James received an unexpected message. His company's board of directors had approved the creation of a new division dedicated solely to developing anti-bias technology for various industries. The success of Project Perspective had opened doors far beyond airport security. The event concluded with a special recognition of the passengers who had recorded the original incident. Their willingness to stand up against discrimination had been the catalyst for everything that followed. Each was presented with a Civilian Courage Award. After the ceremony, James, Michael, and Sarah stood together for photographs. The image would later appear in newspapers worldwide. Three people whose lives had collided in a moment of discrimination, now united in the cause of preventing it. We've come full circle, James observed, looking around the terminal where it all began. But this isn't the end of the story. He was right. Project Perspective had grown beyond any of their expectations, becoming a model for addressing bias in all kinds of institutions. Schools, corporations, and government agencies were now adapting the program for their own needs. As the guests departed, James paused at the security checkpoint where everything had started. The scene was completely different now, efficient, professional, and respectfully run. New officers were being trained, not just in security procedures, but in human dignity. The story that began with one act of discrimination had transformed into a worldwide movement for change. It proved that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best outcomes, if people are willing to learn, grow, and work together for positive change. As James headed toward his gate, he smiled, knowing that his difficult experience had become a catalyst for transformation that would benefit generations to come.